Metroid Prime, the Metroid series' first foray into 3D game design. This is quite a treasured entry in this series, easily considered one of the best games on the GameCube, and even one of the best games ever made. I'm fairly new to the Metroid series, and I don't play a lot of first-person games, so I wasn't really confident this would be my thing going in. Now, having 100%ed it, I can safely say I understand why it's as praised as it is, and am honestly shocked at just how much I ended up enjoying it. That said, there are of course some issues I have about various design choices throughout the game. In this video, I'm going to lay out what I found to be the best and the worst aspects of this game. Please be aware that this review is based on the Metroid Prime Trilogy version of Metroid Prime, with motion-controlled aiming. Also be aware that I played the game on veteran level difficulty, the equivalent of the original difficulty level present in the GameCube version. Be warned that full spoilers for Metroid Prime are on the table. The best. Number 1, controlling Samus. I'm not used to controlling a character in first person. I've often found this perspective claustrophobic, slippery to move around in, and difficult to really know where your character is in relation to everything else. And thankfully, Metroid Prime doesn't have any of those problems. While vision is still limited to first person, you feel so free, even with a heads-up display present at all times. I chalk this up to just how quick and smooth looking around is, and the motion controls make it effortless. Samus feels exceptional to move around with, and is incredibly responsive. You always feel in control of your position, even when jumping around. Aerial mobility has the perfect amount of floatiness and momentum, making platforming, something that is often tricky in first-person games, a breeze in Metroid Prime because of how precise you can be with landing. The Morph Ball also feels wonderful, with snappy movement and thoughtfully designed areas to accompany it. Crawling through tight spaces has never been so fun. Running and shooting while releasing missiles and charge shots just feels so natural. Locking on works well and is easy to use, making for a lot of fast-paced, long-range battles. Changing beam weapons and visors is also quickly pulled off. I'm very impressed with this aspect of the game. I didn't anticipate such a tight execution for controlling a character in first person. Classic Metroid gameplay is superbly adapted to 3D environments in Metroid Prime, which is exceptional for a first try. Number 2, exploration. Talon 4, the primary setting, is a largely desolate and unfamiliar planet that utilizes this series' strengths in full force. A strong sense of mystery pervades every location, with a variety of impactful areas. The deserted Chozo Ruins, a spiritual place plagued with poisonous waters and haunted by the ghosts of the past. The Magmoor Caverns, a fiery series of caves with violent creatures. The Phendrana Drifts, a serene and snowy region filled with space pirate strongholds and research. And the Phazon Mines, the central command of the pirate forces where dark experimentation takes place. Each of these regions are vast, dripping with context, and teeming with natural wildlife. The way each room is designed to provoke thought on how to progress forward or obtain an upgrade is remarkably effective at keeping the player engaged. You're almost always rewarded with interesting and useful things when you take the time to look around. Rooms are incredibly distinct due to their unique geography and memorable, satisfying puzzles. The freedom to tackle things at your own pace is very appreciated and helps exploration feel more natural. You're the one exploring, and the more you experience, the more you get out of it. Number 3, the map. This might feel like a strange thing to highlight, but a useful map is so integral to how the Metroid series works that it needs to function well. Otherwise, navigation could quickly become a disaster. With Metroid Prime being the first 3D entry in the series, I imagine it was important to the developers, Retro Studios, for players to feel confident of their position in the environment. As you can tell by the existence of this point, the map lives up to that need spectacularly. For a game with so much verticality in its area design, a 3D map is crucial, and the ease of moving it around is smooth and effortless. It shows a lot of information, like whether or not you've you've been in a room, door lock colors to know what beams you'll need for certain paths, and distinct names for each individual room, which are essential when searching for the Chozo artifacts. It can be a little tricky to get a handle on, but once you understand it, it's the most useful tool in the game, and has a very positive effect on the experience. Number 4, satisfying upgrades. Metroid games are often designed in a way to rebuff you with roadblocks and puzzles you can't solve yet, but because of this, when upgrades and new tools are found, it's rewarding to remember all the things you can now interact with. And what's great about that is you almost always acquire power-ups that are worth it for recalling these places. When this is an expectation to progressing the game, it's another story that I'll get into more later. But optionally, this is very satisfying. Some items make traversal easier as well, with the different beam weapons taking out enemies swiftly in older areas, as well as suit upgrades that make a lot of places more convenient to cross. It's fantastic, and the sense of Samus becoming more capable is strongly felt with this formula. By the end of the game, you'll have so many weapons and tools at your disposal, and because you hunt them down in such an authentic way, they feel like yours. Which leads me to number 5, immersion and atmosphere. I like games where I feel like I'm in another world, and if that sounds like you, then Metroid Prime has you covered. Talon 4 is such a convincing world, you feel like you're there. You're on this strange planet without much guidance, learning the history of what plagued it while wiping out any of the darkness that remains. The world and story is presented through Samus's eyes, with minimal dialogue, cutscenes, and fanfare, allowing the player to settle into the environment in an instinctive, seamless way. The first-person perspective really puts you in her shoes. The static interference, vibrations, and threat indicators instill a sense of danger because of all the feedback. Enemies and wildlife are well conceptualized with just enough detail to sell you on their believability. Every area is different with its own unique atmosphere. The smothering heat and steam of the Magmore Caverns makes it feel like you're inside a volcano. The Phendrana Drift's snow-covered cliffs are paired with a gentle theme like you're lost in a land of solitude. And the Phazon Mine's deeper, darker areas exude the corruption and toxin overtaking the planet. It truly feels like the heart of evil the deeper in you go. Shout out to the underwater exploration, which is especially convincing due to hindered movement and visibility. The soundtrack deserves plenty of praise as well, adding a lot to each set piece. Metroid Prime's thick atmosphere is impressive, leaving a memorable experience I can't wait to go back to. So it's pretty obvious that Metroid Prime has some phenomenal strengths. I didn't even mention the cool starting sequence on the space frigate. This is a rich game that gives a lot back for the time you put into it, but as much as I enjoyed my time on Talon 4, there are some things that I didn't care for quite so much. The worst. Number 1, direction and flow. While I love that this game lets the player find their own way to proceed, there are some moments that are a little too nonsensical in how progression is expected of the player. I believe that the most effective kind of game design gives players a nudge or logical indication on where they should be heading or what they should be doing next. Metroid Prime generally funnels the player towards their next goal, but there are far too many moments where it's just poorly done. Often, after getting an essential upgrade, you'll be expected to remember a very specific instance from earlier asking for that upgrade's use, which can be over 20 to 30 rooms away and in entirely different regions. Not only do you have to trudge all the way back to that place to find what's there, but you'll often get another power-up in that spot and have to go all the way back to where you were in the first place. It's mind-boggling that these instances are designed this way when going through areas is pretty streamlined otherwise. Returning to old places with upgrades is fun, but not when it's the expectation of moving forward, and especially when it's this specific. The momentum is completely crushed when you make your way through a large area only to be rebuffed because you don't have something in an entirely different place. The game seems to lead you to these dead ends too, aware that you won't have something you need. Backtracking isn't inherently a bad thing, but the way it's framed here doesn't serve the game in a positive way. It's a bad sign when your game has to directly interrupt and tell you which room to go to because you've been durdling around for so long. It flies in the face of any kind of natural guidance, and is completely out of the player's control on when they'll trigger. Metroid Prime does such a great job of teaching things to the player in an organic way, but these moments that come out of nowhere and break up the entire game flow couldn't feel more forced and awkward. Number 2, busy work enemies. Due to the excessive backtracking, you'll find yourself constantly set upon by the same clingy enemies as you travel through areas. Granted, it's fairly easy to ignore them in most rooms, as their chip damage won't make much of a dent, but if you don't even care to take most of them seriously, that's not a good sign for the difficulty of your game. I would not say Metroid Prime is an easy game, but it won't take long to be overflowing with health, and I don't mind feeling powerful, but the real issue is enemies just feel like busy work as opposed to actual threats. And with how many times you'll be running through doors and getting collectibles, it becomes pretty annoying to have to clear out these space pirates in the same places over and over. They're nuisances instead of dangers, especially at the end of the game when you're combing regions for Chozo artifacts. Enemies just respawn too easily, one of the worst offenders being the Chozo ghosts. Fighting them requires a fairly strict pattern that just takes too long, and they constantly respawn throughout the Chozo ruins. They're used way too much for how repetitive they are, and would leave a much stronger impression if they were only used a few times. The late game beam pirates ask for specific weapons to take damage, so unsurprisingly, they're irritating to deal with, especially when multiple types are in one location. Switching beams is easy enough, but these fights couldn't feel more arbitrary. Number 3, contrived roadblocks. Progression is often hindered because you'll need a specific upgrade to open doors or destroy new types of materials, but these tend to be very superficial in how they're integrated. For example, the idea behind different colored doors requiring specific weapons is supposed to be a sort of clearance that allows passage for space pirates, but most space pirates don't wield your weapons, so how are they using them exactly? It's not a big deal, but it hurts the believability and feels decidedly video gamey in a game that generally contextualizes things in sensible ways. Obstructions are another example. Stones, walls, and other blockades are often made from different materials that need the correct weapon to destroy them, but it's kind of hard to buy that only specific things would clear these paths. Bendesium, cordite, sandstone, there's all these random materials for everything, and you kind of have to memorize what destroys what. This is a fairly petty point, but Metroid just does realism and world building so effectively that these elements stand out a lot to me. As is, the player has to scan everything they come across to know what destroys it, preventing much thought when using your weapons to solve puzzles. You scan the substance and use the right weapon. End of story. And I would have liked some kind of visual way to distinguish between materials. Also, if a door's already been opened with the appropriate beam, just make it a normal door after that. It's super tedious to have to change them constantly when running through areas. Number 4, prolonged boss fights. Bosses in Metroid Prime have fantastic aesthetic design, with nicely considered environments to create memorable, tense battles. Hive Mecha, Incinerator Drone, and Flagra are paced well, have properly escalating patterns, and are generally a good challenge. Unfortunately, once you hit Thardis, every boss is repetitive and overstays their welcome. Let's go through them. Thardis has far too much health for how simple this fight is, with no way of making it go any faster. It's a slog. Long after that is the Omega Pirate, a largely disliked boss that fails to provide a satisfying fight for multiple reasons. First of all, moving around the arena and shooting him is just not fun, and second, your attacks seem inconsistent on whether or not they connect, and his moves are a chore to avoid. There are two different ways to take him down, one effective and one not. The first is to use super missiles in the brief windows in which he's vulnerable, which can kill him very quickly, but for how much the Omega Pirate is built up, that's an awfully deflating climax for this fight. Too bad any other way of fighting this boss is completely miserable. An annoying trial of attrition. Hope you like having to deal with beam pirates when you have a filter on, so we're left with a fight that is either simple and anticlimactic, or frustrating and time-consuming. Meta Ridley doesn't fare much better, with a lot of the same issues and another bloated health bar. The first phase where he's flying around isn't too bad, but has a lot of moments of non-interactivity. Once he's on the ground though, it becomes a dreadful grind to get through. The problem is his weak point, which is vulnerable for very short periods of time. Striking it feels inconsistent. The game's really particular about when a shot will connect, and it can easily take up to 10 minutes to finish this second phase because he spends so much time repeatedly jumping and lunging around the arena. A few solid super missile shots to the mouth could have been enough. Finishing the bosses is of course Metroid Prime, who has two forms. The first fight against the exoskeleton takes a while to bring down, but is far more engaging than most other bosses, and happily rewards the use of the special beam upgrades, which are easily ignored throughout the game. It could do with being about a fourth shorter, but it's a pretty good fight, all things considered. The second phase against the core is another cool idea diminished by how long it goes on for. You have to use different visors to see the boss and then stand in phase on to blast it, which is a really fun idea, but far too one note for how many times it needs to be repeated, and unfortunately makes the final phase feel very gimmicky. To sum this all up, too many of Metroid Prime's bosses have long-winded phases that don't allow for much offensive play, leaving long stretches of avoiding attacks that are rarely threatening, waiting for that slim window where you can actually deal damage. Number 5, a few more things. The realisticness of changing visors to see different things takes advantage of Samus's unique perspective. Changing between them is quick, and using them to see in the dark can feel very immersive, but the thermal and X-ray visors are both pretty shallow at the end of the day. Pitch black room you can't see in? Use the thermal visor. No platform to jump on? Use the X-ray visor. There's just not much thought to them. The awkward instances where you have to search out random energy conduits to open a locked door are also very forced. The conduits are just haphazardly littered around the area. The X-ray visor isn't acquired until pretty late and isn't used for much, but I don't care for how it turns the world into milk. The last thing worth mentioning is, around halfway through the game, in the Phendrana Drifts, there are some stalactites in a cave you need to shoot down to create platforms. A video game classic. But for whatever reason, this specific icicle is incredibly particular on where it needs to be hit to knock it loose. And this does not seem intentional. It must be some kind of technical error, as I've easily wasted dozens of missiles trying to get it to drop, until all of a sudden, it just does. I was stuck here for a long time, thinking I needed another upgrade or something because it wouldn't react to my fire. An odd bug, I guess, but worth mentioning as I'm not the only one who's experienced this problem. And that about covers Metroid Prime. I'm really happy to have gotten into this series. I never imagined I'd so passionately enjoy a first-person shooter, but the focus on exploration, rewarding power-ups, and a detailed world are the best things to pull me into this genre. The combat shooter gameplay is a lot of fun, but I don't think it would ever be enough to carry this game on its own for me. Going to a strange and unknown planet in space is filled with so much wonder, and the Metroid series captures that feeling exceptionally well. This is a special experience, one of the best games on the Nintendo GameCube, and now one of my favorite video games. Thank you all so much for watching. If you liked my video, subscribe and check out my Patreon. I'll see you next time.